This is an introduction to my book titled Reformation in the Western World, an Introduction, published in 2017 with Baylor University Press. While Protestantism has become a predominantly non-Western religion, the debate about its relationship to the Western world has not stopped since a group of German historians, sociologists, and theologians started to think about it. In terms of the cultural, social, and political impact, the Reformation was the most important event in the early modern period of the Western world. The nature of the complex relationship between the Reformation and the modern Western world remains an important subject of debate. When thinking about this relationship, many questions immediately emerge. For example, how did the Reformation influence the Western world? Was the Reformation a positive or a negative event? Is the Reformation over, or is it still happening? Did the Reformation lead to democracy, capitalism, and secularism? What relationship did the Reformation have to political power? And how can the Reformation be remembered by both Catholics and Protestants today? In this book, these questions and many others are answered from a historical and ecumenical theological point of view. Following this, the status of ecumenism today and the issue of the Reformation itself in ecumenism are also analyzed. With a view to the commemoration of the Reformation, a handful of positive aspects of the Reformation are proposed that could be, I believe, positively commemorated by both Catholics and Protestants as valuable developments in the history of Christianity. These cannot be seen, of course, in isolation from the other problematic aspects of the history. The Reformation should be remembered in all its dimensions. This book has 7 chapters. In Chapter 1, titled The Western World and the Reformation, the central terminology of the book is discussed. While many people have a general concept about the terms the Western world and the Reformation, there is, in fact, a great deal of disagreement about what these terms actually signify. Both the terms are analyzed from various perspectives in this chapter. As is shown, the Reformation can be understood in many different ways depending on the historical school of thought. In many of these different historical presentations, there is a short Reformation that always seems to find its way into the story. This short Reformation entails some of the most important events of the long Reformation. The short version is introduced and analyzed in this chapter. As is demonstrated, there are many conflicts of interpretation about the most important events of both the short and the long Reformation. While the Reformers made many positive contributions to the Western world, they were also imperfect. Above all, they persecuted people who did not agree with them. In Chapter 2, titled The Evils and Errors of the Reformers, some of these problematic issues are addressed. The Reformers and the Reformation as a whole cannot be fully understood and honestly evaluated without the problematic and negative sides of the history. One of the big questions today concerning the Reformation is the degree to which it was a break with the traditions of the late Middle Ages. In Chapter 3, titled Prehistory, Division, and Authority, an account of the long Reformation is presented. This shows how much the Reformation was dependent upon a history of reform movements in Western Christianity. In this chapter, a few other big questions are addressed regarding the Reformation. How should the division of Christianity in the 16th century be understood? Did it turn the church into the churches? With this, how should the strong emphasis on the authority of scriptures in Protestant theology be understood? How much of this was a new development foreign to the history of Christian thought and theology? As is argued here, in both of these cases there are points of continuity and discontinuity. As the theological and ecclesial reform movements took hold in German lands, the political authorities, the princes and magistrates, were deeply involved in this process. While the princes and magistrates did not develop the theological arguments for reform, they were often convinced of the truth of these arguments and supported the reforms with political power. In some cases, however, they used the movements to consolidate authority and influence in their territorial jurisdictions. In Chapter 4, titled Political Power and Tolerance, this very problematic and complicated aspect of the Reformation is addressed. These ecclesial and political reforming movements often entailed an authoritarian and coercive dimension. In this context, the debate about the freedom of conscience and the separation of church and state became very important. For over a century, historians and theologians have asked themselves how and why the Western world moved away from a church-influenced and nobility-controlled political order to a representative democratic system with the separation of church and state. Did this have to do with basic theological ideas like the priesthood of all believers and understandings of the church, ecclesiology? Or was it more of a historical development that had to do with other things, such as the economy and a changing social order? Another question in this realm is, what role did religion play in the emergence of capitalism, secularism itself? Behind these specific questions is the broader question about the Reformation and modernity. Other issues come into play here as well, like the rise in literacy in the modern period, the liberation of suppressed groups, such as the Jews or so-called heretics, women, and others, the decline of belief in witches and evil spirits, and many others that are largely taken for granted today in the Western world. In Chapter 5, titled Modernity, Democracy, Capitalism, and Secularism, these issues are addressed with a view to the academic debates regarding the Reformation, the Reformation's and Protestantism's influence on each of them. A recurring theme that is found in the theological, philosophical, and historical literature, one that also plays a role in the cultural criticism and socio-political discourse, is the idea that the Western world is in decline. These decline narratives take many different forms. In some cases, the Reformation plays an important role in these narratives. The issue of pluralism in society is often lamented in these narratives, and the Reformation is sometimes seen as the cause of the pluralism. Criticisms of multiculturalism and the growing influence of Islam in the Western world are often drawn into these histories. In Chapter 6, titled The Western World Today, all of these issues are addressed. In addition to this, a positive interpretation of multiculturalism is provided that, at the same time, supports the goal of peaceful social integration. Furthermore, the discussion about Islam in the Western world is also addressed from a historical and contemporary perspective. Attention is drawn to reform movements in Islam and the challenging work of theological interpretation and reinterpretation of the Quran on the part of contemporary Islamic scholars. Through this process of theological interpretation, the Islamic religion can become a strong ally and supporter of the values of the Western world, such as the freedom of religion, democracy, and the equality of women. It will be demonstrated that there is a way of understanding the Western world that is open to multiculturalism and that is also optimistic about the future of Islam in the Western world. In many cases, the discussions about the Western world have often gone together with criticism of multiculturalism and Islam. A different approach is taken in this book, one that is more realistic and pragmatic. In Chapter 7, titled The Reformation and Ecumenism, the status of the Reformation in ecumenical theology and the hopes of the ecumenical movement are analyzed. At the outset, the current situation in ecumenism and its contemporary history are sketched out with a view to the historical context of the 20th century. Some of the progress of the ecumenical movement is also introduced, for example, regarding one of the most important doctrinal issues of the Reformation, the doctrine of justification. With this, the current challenges and hopes of ecumenism are presented before offering a proposal for commemorating the Reformation from an ecumenical perspective. Finally, some of the theological rationale behind ecumenism is laid out. Here, biblical sources, historical theological material, contemporary theology, and modern Catholic encyclicals are interpreted. In the conclusion, attention is drawn to the theology of love and reconciliation.